This man has spent years searching for his true identity. Now he's finally found the answers he's been looking for. College administrator Paul Fronczak grew up believing his parents were Dora and Chester Fronczak. But when he was 10, he found a pile of newspaper clippings stored in a scrapbook. They were about him.
He had lived an entire life believing he knew who he was.
He had been kidnapped.
A loving son. A brother. A husband. A father. His name was Paul Joseph Fronczak, or at least, that's what the world believed. For nearly 50 years, he carried the same story, a story that began with tragedy, but ended in a miracle. He was the baby stolen from a Chicago hospital in 1964. And somehow, against all odds, returned to his parents 2 years later. The headlines called it a miracle reunion. A nation sighed in relief. The Fronczaks got their son back. The case was closed. The world moved on. But the truth didn't. In 2012, curiosity became courage. He sent off a DNA test, just to confirm what everyone had always known. But when the results came back, the world he thought was his, collapsed. The document said, no biological relation. Not to his mother. Not to his father. Not to anyone he had ever known. In one moment, 50 years of identity vanished. The miracle baby wasn't a miracle at all. He was a stranger. A ghost raised in someone else's home. This is the story of a man who learned that his entire life, every birthday, every photograph, every memory, belonged to someone else. And of a family who discovered that the son they'd loved and raised had never been theirs. Because in the world of lost and found, some stories don't end when the child comes home. They begin there. You're watching The Found Files, where missing souls are never forgotten. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to subscribe. Because every time you do, another lost story gets a chance to be told. Don't let this one fade into silence. Chicago, the spring of 1964. A city alive with movement, where the hum of engines blended with the laughter of children and the sound of hope. In a small apartment on the city's south side, Dora and Chester Fronczak were preparing to welcome their first child. They were a quiet couple, hardworking, devoted, and deeply in love. Chester worked long hours as a machinist, Dora, a homemaker with soft eyes and a heart full of anticipation. For them, this baby wasn't just a child, he was a promise. A new beginning. On the morning of April 26, 1964, that promise finally arrived. A healthy baby boy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Named Paul Joseph Fronczak. To Dora, the world stopped. She held him close and whispered prayers of gratitude. To Chester, every sound of that newborn cry was proof that God existed. It was, for one fleeting day, the perfect beginning. But even the brightest light can cast a long shadow. Somewhere beyond the joy, a stranger was watching. Someone who knew this hospital well enough to move through its halls unnoticed. Someone with a plan. For Dora and Chester, that day would be remembered forever as the happiest of their lives. But for the rest of the world, it would soon become one of the darkest. In less than 24 hours, their perfect beginning would be ripped apart. What happened inside Michael Reese Hospital that April morning remains one of the most haunting disappearances in American history. And it all began with a woman in white. April 27, 1964, the morning after the perfect beginning. Inside Michael Reese Hospital, sunlight spilled through the blinds of room 207. Dora Fronczak stirred awake to the sound of her newborn's soft breathing. Her baby boy, Paul Joseph, is only 1 day old. A woman dressed in a crisp white uniform entered the room, polite, composed, carrying the quiet authority of a nurse. She smiled, said she needed to take baby Paul for a routine exam, and gently lifted him from Dora's arms. To Dora, it was nothing unusual. She had seen nurses come and go all morning. So when the woman left the room, she thought nothing of it. She rested her head on the pillow and drifted back to sleep. Minutes turned into hours. The hallway grew busier. But the woman in white never returned. When Dora awoke, the room was quiet, too quiet. Her arms reached instinctively for her son's cradle. It was empty. She pressed the call button. No answer. She called for a nurse. Nothing. And then, the scream. Within minutes, hospital staff realized the unthinkable. The woman who had taken baby Paul was not a nurse. No one recognized her. No one had seen her leave. She had simply vanished, and so had the newborn. News broke across Chicago within hours. Every radio, every newspaper, every headline screamed the same words. Baby stolen from hospital. The city erupted in panic. Hospitals tightened security. The FBI joined the search. Airports, train stations, and bus depots were swarmed with agents and officers holding the baby's picture. For Dora and Chester, time stopped. Every second felt like a lifetime. They stood in the empty nursery, the crib unmade, the air heavy with silence. All they could do was pray. Dora replayed that moment in her head over and over. The nurse's calm smile. The soft rustle of white fabric. The doors closing. And then, nothing. Days turned to weeks. The investigation expanded across state lines. Witnesses described the suspect as a woman in her 30s, neatly dressed, confident, invisible in plain sight. But there were no fingerprints. No clues. No sign of baby Paul. Dora sat alone in that empty room, staring at the hospital door that had swallowed her child. Every night, she whispered his name into the dark. Paul, come home. The world had moved on to other stories. But the Fronczaks never did. For over a year, their lives stood still, waiting, praying, hoping for a miracle. And in 1965, that miracle seemed to arrive. For 2 years, the Fronczak home in Chicago was a place suspended in grief. The nursery stayed untouched, the mobile still hung above an empty crib, its tiny stars collecting dust. Chester and Dora tried to move forward, but every holiday, every child's laugh on the street, was a reminder of what was stolen from them. Then, on a damp day in 1966, over 800 miles away in Newark, New Jersey, fate seemed to stir again. Police were called to a department store parking lot, where a toddler had been found abandoned, sleeping inside a small stroller. He was around 2 years old, dark hair, big brown eyes, a quiet, healthy boy with no name, no papers, no trace of who left him there. The authorities had no leads, but his resemblance to the missing Chicago baby was uncanny. So, when the FBI compared the boy's ear shape and other early forensic clues, the kind available in the 1960s, the conclusion came back: he could be Paul Fronczak. The call came through to the Fronczak home. Dora dropped the phone. Chester had to steady her before she could speak. 2 years of mourning suddenly turned into disbelief. Could it really be him? When they flew to New Jersey and saw the little boy waiting, Dora ran straight into his arms. She held him so tightly that the child began to cry. But even through the tears, she smiled. She looked into those brown eyes and whispered, "You're home now, Paulie. You're finally home." The newspapers celebrated the miracle. "Stolen baby found," screamed the headlines. America rejoiced at the idea that even after 2 long years, love had triumphed over loss. But beneath the applause, something subtle went unnoticed, something the world, and even the Fronczaks, didn't realize. The boy in Dora's arms wasn't crying because he recognized his mother. He was crying because she was a stranger. Life continued anyway. The child grew up in Chicago as Paul Joseph Fronczak. He learned to ride a bike in the same streets his parents once searched for him. He blew out birthday candles every April. The family photos show laughter, smiles, and milestones, but hidden behind each image was a question that never quite went away. Why did he never feel like he truly belonged? Why didn't his reflection ever quite match the memories his parents described? He didn't know it yet, but the life he was living, the identity he'd been given, and the family he called his own, were all built on a beautiful mistake. He wasn't the lost baby. He was another lost child entirely. It had been nearly 5 decades since that tearful reunion in Newark. The boy once called the miracle child was now a grown man, Paul Fronczak, living in Las Vegas, working an ordinary job, raising his own family. From the outside, life looked steady. But inside, there was a question that refused to rest. Ever since childhood, Paul had felt different. His parents loved him, but there was always a distance he couldn't explain. He didn't resemble them. Family stories never quite aligned. There were no baby photos from his earliest days, no proof of the 2 missing years before he was found. And when he'd ask questions, the answers always seemed too rehearsed or avoided altogether. As he grew older, the feeling deepened into something darker. What if the reunion the world celebrated had been a mistake? That thought haunted him for years. Until one day in the early 2010s, while applying for a passport, Paul needed his birth certificate and realized he didn't actually have one that matched his life story. The state records didn't add up. The official documents were off. And that's when the silence of the past began to crack. Paul decided to take a DNA test, a decision that would shatter everything he thought he knew. He sent it off casually, almost doubting anything would come of it. But when the results came back, there was no match to the Fronczak family. None. Genetically, he wasn't their son. He wasn't Paul Joseph Fronczak at all. In a single moment, everything he had believed about his life unraveled. The newspaper clippings, the reunion photos, even his name, all part of someone else's story. Paul was, in truth, a missing person himself. He called his parents, Chester and Dora, hoping for answers. But instead of relief, the call reopened old wounds. Dora was heartbroken, defensive, afraid to lose the son she had raised. She said, "You're my Paul. You'll always be my Paul." But Paul couldn't stop now. That test had awakened something inside him, the need to know where he truly came from, who had left him in that stroller in Newark, and what happened to the real Paul Fronczak, the baby stolen from the hospital all those years ago. He reached out to journalists, genealogists, and private investigators. What began as curiosity turned into a quest for truth, a man searching for 2 lost children, the one he was, and the one he had replaced. Every discovery deepened the mystery. His DNA revealed distant relatives scattered across the country, hints of a family he had never known. A new name began to surface in the records, a name buried under years of secrecy. The truth was closer than he imagined. And yet, it would break hearts before it healed them. Because the real Paul Fronczak, the child who vanished from his mother's arms in 1964, was still missing. And the man who'd been raised in his place was about to uncover who he truly was. Every lie, every unanswered question, every missing page in Paul's life, was about to converge into a single, earth-shattering truth. For years, he had lived as Paul Joseph Fronczak, the miracle baby from Chicago. But now, through countless DNA matches and genealogical digging, a new identity began to emerge from the shadows, a name connected to a missing child from Atlantic City, a family who never knew what had happened to their little boy. That boy's name was Jack Rosenthal. The DNA trail confirmed it. The child found abandoned in Newark in 1966, the one who grew up believing he was Paul Fronczak, was actually Jack, a twin, one of 2 babies born into a deeply troubled family. And that revelation carried another horror. Jack's twin sister, Jill, was never found. No records. No sightings. It was as though she had vanished from existence entirely. Paul, now Jack, realized he hadn't just uncovered his own lost identity, he had stumbled into another unsolved disappearance. One that might never be solved. The child who was stolen from a Chicago hospital. And the twin who disappeared from a broken home. 2 children whose lives were never supposed to cross, but did. Every time I find an answer, it opens another door. I was stolen, but so was he. Somewhere out there, there's a part of me still missing. Meanwhile, the real Paul Joseph Fronczak, the baby taken from the Chicago hospital in 1964, was still out there, living an ordinary life under another name, unaware of the history attached to him. In 2019, after years of investigation, genealogists finally located him. He was alive. Healthy. living in Michigan, a quiet man, a father, a husband. He had no idea he had once been at the center of one of America's most haunting kidnapping mysteries. He chose to remain private, away from the media storm. But for the first time in over 50 years, the question that haunted a nation had an answer. The real Paul was alive. The boy raised as Paul was Jack. And two families, torn apart by unimaginable loss, finally knew the truth. But closure doesn't always mean peace. For the Fronczaks, the truth reopened wounds long scarred over. Dora, Paul's adoptive mother, still called him her son. She said love had nothing to do with DNA, that the boy she raised would always be her Paul. And for Jack, it meant rebuilding an entire identity from scratch, learning to grieve the life he thought he had, and the sister he might never find. He began as a found baby. He grew up as a mystery. And he became a man who refused to stop searching, not just for himself, but for all the lost children who never made it home. After decades of searching, testing, and uncovering, two families now stood at the edge of a revelation that had rewritten everything they believed about love, blood, and belonging. For the man once known as Paul Fronczak, now revealed as Jack Rosenthal, every answer had come at a cost. The story that began with a stolen baby now returned to where it always belonged, to the faces behind the names. He met members of his biological family, cousins, nieces, distant relatives who'd spent their lives unaware of the missing twin, unaware that their family's tragedy had crossed states in decades. Their faces carried shock, sorrow, and something else, recognition. The same eyes. The same expressions. For the first time, he could look at someone and see himself reflected back. But reunion doesn't always mean joy. Many of his biological relatives carried their own pain, their own silence. The Rosenthal home had been one of darkness, trauma, and neglect, the kind of past that leaves generations trying to forget. For some, his arrival reopened wounds they'd buried long ago. For others, it was a chance to finally face what had been hidden. In that moment, Paul, or Jack, realized something profound. Sometimes, finding your roots doesn't mean finding comfort. Sometimes, it means finding the truth so that it can't hurt anyone else again. Back in Chicago, the reunion with the Fronczak family carried its own bittersweet beauty. Dora Fronczak, the woman who had held him in that Newark airport decades earlier, was now frail, her hair silver, her hands trembling. Yet her love for him had never changed. When he walked back into her home, she didn't see a mystery or a stranger. She saw her son. She opened her arms and whispered, "You'll always be my Paul." He hugged her, tears blurring his eyes. Because for all the tests, the documents, the facts, this was the woman who had kissed his scraped knees, sat at his bedside, and prayed for him every night. DNA couldn't erase that. The reunion wasn't a single moment. It was a realization that he didn't have to choose one family over the other. He belonged to both stories. He was the living proof that love and loss can coexist. And in the end, when the real Paul Fronczak, the baby stolen from that Chicago hospital, was confirmed alive, the world seemed to exhale. Two lost children, once bound by confusion, now stood as men who had survived what most would never comprehend. Each had been robbed of a childhood, yet each had built a life, a testament to resilience, to identity, to the power of truth. He turned his story into purpose. He wrote his book, The Foundling, not for fame, but for closure, for every parent still waiting, and every child who has ever felt misplaced in their own life. Because at the heart of it all, his journey wasn't just about DNA. It was about finding a place to belong, even after the truth has broken everything open. There are stories that live in headlines. And then there are stories that live in the human heart. Paul Joseph Fronczak's story, or rather, the stories of two boys who shared one name, is not about crime or scandal. It's about identity, loss, and the deep, unbreakable thread of love that runs even through decades of silence. He was stolen before he could take his first steps. Raised under another family's hope. And decades later, he became the man who had to piece together not just his past, but himself. It's hard to imagine what it means to live a life built on someone else's tragedy, To love a family that isn't yours by blood, yet remains yours by every act of the heart. But that's what Paul, or Jack, did. He carried both lives inside him. The boy without a past. The man who found his truth. The stranger who turned out to be someone's son, twice over. And in a world where millions of children are still missing, some stolen, some lost to time, this story stands as a reminder that miracles don't always come wrapped in joy. That sometimes, truth hurts before it heals. And that behind every missing person's photo is a family still whispering their name, still waiting for the knock on the door that changes everything. Paul's journey ended with more questions than answers, his twin sister, Jill, still missing, the real Paul living quietly, far from the noise. But his search gave meaning to others, proof that even after decades, the truth can still be found. And that's why we tell these stories. Because silence only wins when we stop listening. Because names only fade when we stop saying them. Every time you click away from a story like this, another one disappears unheard. Every time you scroll past a missing face, another family spends another night in silence. If you've made it this far, if you've felt even a flicker of what these families live every day, then don't just watch. Be part of the search. At the Found Files, every story we tell carries a heartbeat, a plea for truth, a call for hope. By subscribing, by sharing, by keeping these names alive, you help bring the lost a little closer to home. So don't let this be the last file you open. Because somewhere, right now, another family is still waiting for their miracle. And the next story we uncover might be the one that finally gives it to them. For the lost, the found, and those still waiting. Subscribe. Share. Stay with us. This is the Found Files.